Rod Serling's classic American television series, The Twilight Zone, ran for 5 seasons, from 1959 to 1964. It's interesting to note that some of the most iconic and best episodes of the series premiered during its first season, like, for instance, Time Enough at Last, or The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street. This makes it all the more impressive that the 5th and final season of the show also contains some of its best, like In Praise of Pip, Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, and Living Doll. It's natural, then, that with so many great episodes scattered throughout the series, many tend to fall by the wayside, critically speaking. One such episode, in my opinion, is Season 5, Episode 7, titled The Old Man in the Cave. This episode takes place in an alternate 1974, 10 years after a nuclear war has all but destroyed the United States. Here in the American wasteland, a small community of survivors struggles to get by in a nameless town that's totally not just the set of an old western. The townsfolk are in possession of some canned food, but they're not sure if it's safe or not, so they have to wait for a man named Goldsmith to return from his meeting with the mysterious old man that lives in a nearby cave. Some of the townsfolk want to go ahead and just eat the food now, but another one of them reminds them that last time they didn't listen to the old man and planted their seeds in an area that he said was unsafe to plant in, the food that did grow there was deformed and inedible. And not in a Burger King kind of way. A man named Jason backs up the other townsmember, saying that the old man does seem to have a way with land.
The old man indeed. Who knows where he gets his omniscient knowledge? But Evie's right. He knows about land.
When Goldsmith returns, he tells the townsfolk that the old man says the food is irradiated and unsafe to eat, which bums everybody out. Soon, a group of soldiers arrive in town, commanded by a Major French. The Major assumes an attitude of authority, saying that he and his men have been sent by what remains of the federal government, although he's pretty vague about it.
Major French is my name. Central States Command. We're being sent around to organize.
Organize?
Yes, that's what I said.
French begins asking questions about the town's population and supplies, demanding housing and food for himself and his men. But Goldsmith, who calls himself the town authority, says that the Major and his men are not the first soldiers to show up there, and the others all turned out to be renegades gone AWOL and looking for an easy meal. French insists that he and his men are a new breed, and that they've been sent to organize the various remaining towns into military sectors, each controlled by a local constabulary, which he says in this case will be himself and his men. Goldsmith says that the soldiers are welcome to food and housing for the night, but that they should leave the next morning. The Major offers to let Goldsmith keep his position, but only in a symbolic fashion, as the Major would be the one really in control, and then backhands him. He says that between Buffalo, New York and Atlanta, Georgia, there are probably only around 500 people left alive.
Well, because there's no authority, there's no discipline. And we're here to give you a little of both.
The Major then says that if Goldsmith gives him and his men any more trouble, they'll hang him from a balcony, with the implication being that this will act as a warning to the others. French then notices the canned food, and Goldsmith tells him it's contaminated, but French is skeptical and asks who says it's contaminated. That's when Goldsmith explains about the old man in the cave, who provides the town with information but does not show himself. French says that he's not surprised, as he and his men have encountered many strange cults across the American wasteland, and this is obviously just one more. French decides to visit the old man and finds that the cave is sealed by a large metal door. The Major tries to blow open the door with a grenade and fails. The townsfolk react with laughter, visibly bruising the Major's ego. Back in town, Major French finally convinces the townsfolk to start eating the canned food. Even Jason eventually joins in, but Goldsmith refuses, telling the Major that he's brought ruin to this town. Major French, frustrated and likely influenced by alcohol, declares to the town that there is no old man, and that Goldsmith made him up as some kind of grift. The soldiers and townsfolk head down to the cave and demand that Goldsmith open the door. Goldsmith reminds the townsfolk that the old man has kept them alive this whole time, Jason says that while they have survived for 10 years, they haven't really lived, and he wants to see the old man too. But Goldsmith says that that's not the old man's fault. Finally, Goldsmith relents and opens the cave door with a secret mechanism. When the people enter, they discover that the cave does not contain an old man, but rather a pre-war computer. The townsfolk are stunned. Major French declares that the computer is their tyrant and they must kill it. The townsfolk begin hurling rocks and beating the computer with sticks. Major French then stands atop the wrecked computer and declares that they are free, looking over at Goldsmith in a gloating fashion. We then transition back to town, where the camera pans across a row of bodies. The entire town, except for Goldsmith, are dead, killed by radiation poisoning. Goldsmith stands over the body of Major French and says that he doesn't really blame him. Goldsmith says that faithlessness is to blame, as he continues his tour of the graveyard that used to be his town. Based on the short story The Old Man by Henry Slezar, The Old Man in the Cave first premiered on November 8, 1963, only a few months after the apparent date of the nuclear war mentioned in the episode. The episode is rarely cited by mainstream critics and is often discussed in a negative light, possibly because the ending is considered hokey or cheap, and even the guys on the Blu-ray commentary track seem to wish that they were talking about something else. Personally, I regard it, like many episodes of The Twilight Zone, as being more akin to a fable than a science fiction story. And so the logic of how the computer is able to function without any obvious electricity source, just for example, doesn't really matter to me. Another potential issue that some viewers may have with the episode is that there's just so many different ideas in it. In the closing narration, Serling mentions greed as a focal point, but Goldsmith talks about faithlessness. James Coburn's character essentially leads or is part of a burgeoning junta, or military dictatorship. While it may come off as muddled to some, I would say that this episode offers an embarrassment of riches as far as themes go. Firstly, and perhaps most overtly, the episode deals with themes of religion. In fact, the entire story can be seen as a kind of parable for the loss of trust in religion or religious institutions. In this interpretation, the old man, an unseen, complex computer capable of knowing things that the townsfolk never could, represents God, who could never be seen or fully understood by his followers. Goldsmith is a holy man delivering God's word to the faithful, or just someone who defends the idea of religion. Major French is a skeptic who slowly erodes the faith of the townsfolk until they eventually turn away from God's word and then from God himself, with predictable consequences. Although this interpretation may seem an appropriate one, some critics have found it, and the episode itself, to be lacking. Science fiction author and critic Mark Scott Zicree, in his book The Twilight Zone Companion, says of the episode, "In actuality, a computer is not a god, it is a man-made tool, and the townsfolk's insistence to know the true nature of their leader seems less an act of faithlessness than a natural human curiosity for vital information, a desire for democracy, for self-determination." First off, obviously a computer is not a god. It's called a metaphor, Mark. And as I said, a computer is sometimes capable of possessing information we do not. It is a non-human entity, unfettered by emotions or ego, and its wealth of knowledge is certainly more than anyone in this town could possibly possess. Secondly, whether or not the concept of a god is itself man-made is kind of up to interpretation, so Zicree's criticism can be easily countered. I do want to say real quick, though, that I was being kind of jokingly rude to Zicree. Actually, he's a very important man when it comes to the Twilight Zone history. He's a man who was able to get lots of real documents, real recordings of Serling talking, and his Twilight Zone Companion book is definitely worth picking up, whether or not you agree with his takes on the episodes. He's definitely a great Twilight Zone scholar. I mean, I don't want to suggest that I, think any less of him. That I could never approach the accomplishments that Mr. Zicree has made. Nevertheless, I'm going to have a little fun giving him some shit about this because I actually do think this is a great episode, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about what it means. Besides the general religious or philosophical ideas, though, there are more material implications. According to many historians, one of the trends that precipitated the French Revolution was a general loss of faith in Catholicism in French society. This trend was not without reason, as the church had aligned itself with the French nobility and was largely corrupt. In the words of historian and politician Hilaire Belloc, while in the wealthy, the bureaucratic, and the governing classes, to ridicule the faith was an attitude taken for granted, seriously to attack the privileges or position of its ministers was ungentlemanly and was not allowed. The abandonment of religion by all but a very few of the French millions no more affected the ecclesiastical officials of the time than does the starvation of our poor affect, let us say, one of our professional politicians. The swoon of the faith in the 18th century is the negative foundation upon which the strange religious experience of the French was about to rise. France, in the generation before the Revolution, was passing through a phase in which the Catholic faith was at a lower ebb than it had ever been since the preaching and establishment of it in Gaul. In 1789, all land and property in France owned by the Catholic Church was seized by the National Constituent Assembly, the first government of the Revolution, and eventually a campaign of de-Christianization was waged, in which religious worship was essentially banned and religious symbols were removed or publicly defaced. In place of Catholicism, some promoted the ominously titled Cult of Reason, which would eventually be supplanted by the even more overtly religious Cult of the Supreme Being. All this accompanied the Reign of Terror, a series of massacres and public executions, and the power vacuum created by the Revolution would inevitably result in a dictatorship, led by former Brigadier General in the French Army, Napoleon Bonaparte. As I've mentioned, James Coburn's character is named Major French, though I'm sure that's just a coincidence. But it does mean that an appropriate alternate title for this episode would be The French Revolution. Of course, it can also be argued that the revolution in France was a necessary event, as it finally created a more equal society. But in the short term, its immediate effect was mass murder. Some authors have suggested that a widespread loss of faith in God is at least partially responsible for the rise of various totalitarian regimes in the early 20th century. For example, psychologist Carl Jung, in his 1957 book, The Undiscovered Self, wrote, "The state has taken the place of God. That is why, seen from this angle, the socialist dictatorships are religions, and state slavery is a form of worship. The townsfolk are depicted as being essentially passive in nature, and their slowly unfolding revolution against the old man doesn't lead them to any kind of newfound individuality. They destroy the computer pretty much the second the major tells them to, without the slightest pushback. The original short story by Henry Slezar is even more direct in its religious metaphors. In this version, most of the narrative takes place at a clandestine political meeting of the townsfolk, where a slightly mutated anti-old man agitator gives a speech to the crowd about the need to rid themselves of the seemingly parasitic figure that controlled the town. The meeting is observed by a spy working for the old man's governors. Rather than a cave, the old man lives in the so-called stone house, which is the only building in the town with electricity. In the end, the people storm the stone house, killing the old man's governors, and, like the people in the episode, discover that the old man is actually a computer and end up destroying it. Two characters in the story say that their fathers saw the old man once. One man's father told him that the old man appeared like the biblical figure of Moses, and another one said that he looked like Buddha, making it clear that the old man represents the concept of God or of religion more than a metaphor for an actual God. The electricity which is devoted to the old man's stone house can be compared to the wealth that followers devote to their various religious institutions, which may seem to some to be a frivolous waste. As a side note, one could also see the myth of the old man as a manifestation of Plato's noble lie, a mythology intended to provide the philosophical foundation for Plato's conception of an ideal society. However deep the religious metaphors may run through Serling's adaptation, his revisions to the material add more depth and widen the number of possible interpretations. For instance, another way to view the episode is as a comment on the nature of military dictatorships. We can see from my description of the original story that Rod Serling created most of what we see in the episode, and of particular interest is his inclusion of the four soldiers and their role in the narrative. Major French directly states that he is transforming various towns into military sectors, and that he and his men will act as a constabulary, basically a police force, to control the town. This would essentially be martial law, or a military dictatorship. Rather than simply take the town by force, however, the Major then offers for Goldsmith to act as a sort of figurehead through which Major French would control the town.
Now, we'd like you to make your transition here as easy as possible. Now, under certain circumstances, we might even allow you to remain in nominal control.
In his classic book on the role of the military in politics, The Man on Horseback, British political scientist and historian Samuel Feiner notes, "At first glance, the characteristic mode of military intervention is the violent overturn of a government. Yet the military often work on governments from behind the scenes, and even when they do establish a military dictatorship, they usually fabricate some quasi-civilian facade of government behind which they retire as fast as possible. Overt military rule is therefore comparatively rare and apparently short-lived. It is this that gives the appearance of transience to military regimes. But the modes of military intervention are as often latent or indirect as they are overt or direct." According to Feiner, militaries only intervene in civilian politics when they have both the disposition to intervene and the opportunity. French and his men clearly have the disposition to intervene, and they even claim that they're just following orders. As for opportunity, this town practically has a red neon sign above it that says, "Please coup us." The damage done by the war has set this community, along with the entire country, quite a ways back in terms of development, which makes it relatively easy for the Major and men like him to assume control of small communities like this one. According to Feiner, whether or not a country falls into military dictatorship is often determined by the level of what he calls political culture in the country. According to Feiner, political culture is high in states where the political formula, i.e. the belief or emotion by virtue of which the rulers claim the moral right to govern and be obeyed, is generally accepted. Or, to say this in another way, where the complex of civil procedures and organs which jointly constitute the political system are recognized as authoritative, i.e. as duty-worthy, by a wide consensus. Or, again, in other words, where public involvement in and attachment to these civil institutions is strong and widespread. Nations with higher political culture are less likely to suffer a military dictatorship, while nations with lower political culture are much more vulnerable to them. Feiner notes, "The characteristic of states at the lowest level of political culture is not that there are no people able and willing to hold political ideas, but that there are so few and so scattered as to be altogether negligible when political issues are to be decided. The passive nature of the townsfolk is an aspect that seems impossible to ignore, and for some people it could even be considered a major flaw in the story, though for me it makes total sense that a community that's been essentially sent back to the Stone Age would become apathetic. Inevitably, such people might come to see comfort and order as the most important goals." Feiner writes, "The decline of confidence in the politicians and civil processes is liable to enhance the popularity of the military. By the same token, it weakens the authority of the civilian regime and renders it an easier prey to the intervention of the army, which, in these circumstances, comes to be regarded as a deliverer. Finally, there's the fact that much of the Major's actions appear to be influenced by his own ego. According to Feiner, militaries that intervene in civilian politics will sometimes suffer from a kind of superiority complex, which Feiner calls morbidly high self-esteem. To quote Feiner again, "Armies exist, or have existed, with a morbidly high opinion of themselves as compared with the rest of society. Affronts, or imagined affronts, to their pride tend to spark such armies into intervention more quickly than in the former classes, and for causes that are objectively much slighter. Here again, their self-esteem is nettled by vicarious humiliations, as well as by direct ones or by society's rejection of their pretensions. For examples, Feiner notes the German Reichswehr officers of the First World War, who were so embarrassed by their defeat They refused to admit they'd been defeated at all, blaming instead politicians, socialists, and Jews. All this despite the fact that the German High Command was well aware by June 1918 that they had, in fact, lost the war. Feiner also mentions the Spanish Army's role in the dictatorship of Primo de Rivera in 1923. Finally, one must notice the quite morbid superiority feeling of the Army of Spain. We have already had occasion to remark how this army, from about 1900 onwards, had felt rejected by society and had drawn hermetic boundaries around itself, nourishing itself on its own values and hating without understanding the movements of separatism and socialism and syndicalism that were surging through Spain. After its decisive and humiliating defeat by the Moors at Anuel in 1921, the Spanish officers reacted like the Greek officers after Smyrna, or the German officers after 1918, or the Egyptian officers after 1948, or the French officers after Dien Bien Phu. The Spanish army never thought to blame itself, but accused the civilians of betraying it. From this disastrous humiliation, it responded, as commonly, by seeking psychological compensation elsewhere. If the Spanish army had not defeated the Reef, it would show that it could at least defeat its own civilians. And going back to my earlier topic, Feiner explicitly notes the French Revolution as being the origin, or seed plot, of the modern military intervention. Finally, I want to close with a note on themes. The Twilight Zone often suffers critically from a problem that I would describe as every problem looking like a nail because you always want to use a hammer. And what I mean by that is, pretty much everybody wants to see every episode of The Twilight Zone through the lens of McCarthyism. It's always about McCarthyism. But as a matter of fact, that's a theme that's not quite as frequently explored in the show as people seem to think that it is. Or at the very least, it can be explored more through feelings or vibes or tones. Major French definitely has the vibe of what you would call a demagogue. And one can easily see the fumes of McCarthyism kind of falling all over that. But this is not an episode that I think is overtly connected with McCarthyism. And Major French does not engage in extravagant accusations that he cannot prove. He doesn't really even engage in any kind of scapegoating against Goldsmith. He just undermines him and overthrows him. And that's why I think that the religious interpretation, but also the military intervention interpretation, are the ones that I think are most accurate here. Just like with my video on It's a Good Life, I am not claiming that this is actually what Rod Serling was thinking about when he was making the episode. I have no idea what he was thinking about. It is very possible that Serling read The Man on Horseback. It was published about a year and 10 months before the episode came out, but I also have no idea if he ever read it, and I certainly have no evidence that he ever read it. It's also not necessary for him to have read it for my interpretation to work. Serling's experience in the military would have taught him many of the ideas that I talk about here. So it's not necessary for him to have read that specific book for it to be useful in this interpretation. Besides everything else, this episode is also a beautiful display of the series' actors. John Anderson as Goldsmith gives an appropriately stern performance. Anderson was a staple of television acting for decades and would appear in such other classic series as The Outer Limits, Gunsmoke, and Alfred Hitchcock Presents. And he would also have a small role in Psycho. Anderson would also appear in 3 other episodes of the original Twilight Zone: A Passage for Trumpet, The Odyssey of Flight 33, and Of Late I Think of Cliffordville. John Marley, as Jason, gives a very understated performance, as a guy who's probably seen some messed up stuff. It's not hard to see how he eventually turns on Goldsmith, and having him start out as defending the old man is a great way to show his desperation growing. Marley, another veteran of the Twilight Zone, had appeared in Season 3's Kick the Can. Some of Marley's notable roles include a starring role in John Cassavetes' film Faces, and a memorable role in Francis Ford Coppola's The Godfather. Finally, James Coburn is pitch perfect as Major French. The way he plays the character, you can honestly interpret him in multiple ways. He gives plenty of indication of his arrogance and resentment of his current position, but he also sells the idea that Major French could genuinely believe that these people are being conned by Goldsmith, making his actions the result of a combination of factors, at giving the story and the character more depth. Coburn would also appear in such classic films as The Great Escape, The Magnificent Seven, Duck You Sucker, and The President's Analyst. The episode is directed by prolific director of almost 70 feature films and television episodes, Alan Crosland Jr. One strange discrepancy in the episode is that one of the townsfolk at the beginning of the story says that the canned food was canned before the bomb, and that would presumably make it safe to eat. But later, towards the end of the episode, Goldsmith says that most of the food was canned after the bombs fell. This discrepancy could be explained by a deleted scene or by assuming that the characters are referring to two separate sets of cans, but honestly it's probably just a mistake. It happens sometimes, and it doesn't ruin the episode, but I can understand someone complaining about it. While there are episodes with better premises and better story structures, this episode offers a more complex, perhaps messy statement on society's tendency to destroy itself, and regardless of how one interprets it, I would say that it's well worth watching. The Old Man in the Cave can be found on DVD and Blu-ray sets of the Twilight Zone Season 5, as well as the complete series box sets, and the episode is also available to stream on Paramount Plus and YouTube Premium.